So my name is Hanna Nieber. I'm an anthropologist and I did my PhD partly here at the ZMO and partly also at the Berlin Graduate School of Muslim Cultures and Societies. I am currently a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle. My dissertation was titled Drinking the Written Qur'an, Healing with Kombe in Zanzibar Town. And probably many people don't know what Kombe is, so I'll quickly explain. When you take a ceramic plate and you write a Quranic verse with saffron ink on it, and then you wash this ink off and collect this water then contains the Qur'an, and this is used for drinking, for healing properties, because it has healing properties, and it can be given to patients as medicine. Zanzibar Town is a very interesting town, lots of history there to be dealt with, lots of politics also, and the politics became partly important, but I will tell that in a second step. So my first step is that I engaged with two different healers. One of them was very interested in claiming or in portraying himself as an Islamic scholar, and he then would prepare Kombe in a very in a professional way, or he portrayed himself as professional, and so it was very important how he calculated which verse to use and what actually the illness is of the person who came to him, and so this was the one context where I learned a lot about the Islamic framework in which this is happening. The other person that I also saw regularly is a woman who has a herbal place. It's called Dawaya Asili, which means, or which gets translated as traditional medicine, and she treats with all kinds of things, particularly with small wooden sticks that then the patients receive to boil them at home in water to make their own medicine with these sticks. But then, because it doesn't hurt, and because in Zanzibar we have a Muslim majority of more than 90%, it's always good to have the Qur'an as an additional healing agent. So she would also give Kombe to people as an addition. So we have these two people who use and who also prepare Kombe in very different ways, and I visited both of them for now I have to think. So I was in fieldwork for 19 months and I visited each of them basically every week. And so this is the relation that I built very strongly. These are the relations. Then around that I plotted interviews. I found that in the one context I had, for example, very good conversations about I don't know, a certain madrasa or something like that, and so I would follow that up and look for an interview with somebody from that madrasa. Yeah, so this is how I navigated my time. As I said, politics is very important in Zanzibar because Zanzibar is a semi-autonomous part of Tanzania. In Zanzibar, during the time that I was there was lots of talk about a new constitution, so everybody was thinking about how should this relation to Tanzania be in the future. For me that was very interesting because Islam plays for the identification of Zanzibar as something else from the Tanzanian mainland a very big role. And so when I was asking questions about Islam, everybody would immediately also talk about the importance of Islam in Zanzibar. There were then also talks about Zanzibar becoming independent from Tanzania, but in this whole framework, my interest in all people taking this particular medicine, including Christians, was something that was very political. Yeah. And I thought it was quite interesting how the discourse is very antagonistic. So it's a very clear-cut line between Muslims and Christians. What I also find interesting is that the Muslims use this discourse for their independence movement. The Christians equally use this discourse as portraying themselves not as minority in Zanzibar, but because Zanzibar is part of the Tanzanian nation state, they don't perceive themselves as minority. They're just like a part, because in Tanzania there is a much more equal percentage of how many Muslims and how many Christians you have. So I traced this discourse on the one hand, but then I also looked at what are the practices that people do not talk about, including, for example, drinking Kombe. And there, these boundaries get much more blurry. So Christians do drink the Qur'an, and for them it's also an appreciation of being in Zanzibar, and because in Zanzibar you have a lot of Muslims, and if you have a lot of Muslims, then of course the traditional healers are Muslim, and so if you want to go to a traditional healer, then you take what they give you, and so for them taking Islamic medicine was more about like claiming space also in Zanzibar, while for the Muslims, they invited, of course, the Christians to also drink this medicine because they said, well, you know, the Qur'an is there for everyone and everyone can get healing, and we are not the ones to judge whether God has another plan for them. Maybe they will become Muslims at some later stage. And so everybody was very welcoming for Christians to drink Kombe, while the discourse itself was very antagonistic. My dissertation has two parts, and the two parts have a sort of different angle. So the one part I just talked about now was more this lens on the social situation. The other part was more looking at the practice itself and what is happening with the materialities that are involved there. So I was really interested, for example, in the body. How is the body conceptualized in Swahili for Swahili people? How does that relate to Islamic scholarship on the body? And I found it, maybe I can just tell the small anecdote, I found it very interesting how whenever I would speak or I would initiate a conversation about the body, we were, of course, also bodies that were talking to each other. So what my interlocutors did, and I only found this later when I was listening to all the recordings, that they immediately went on another level and talked metaphorically about the body. So that was to take away the topic that we were speaking about from the situation where we also were two bodies in a room. And I found this very interesting, how this metaphor then enabled the interlocutors to connect for me in new ways what the body is, what the body means. One of them, for example, said the body is like an airplane. It has like nafsi and ruhu and kiwiliwili, which is the spirit, soul. It's quite difficult to translate. And the bodily substance, they all fly together, and if the airplane crashes, then they all crash. So this was to explain to me how they belong together. On the one hand, this was the point he wanted to make, but it also he also chose a metaphor that he knew that I could connect to, because he knew that I was coming with the airplane, and so he sort of tried to find a metaphor that would enable me to have these close associations of intimacy while we were speaking about the body without thinking about the bodies that we were in the situation. So I thought like the ways that people speak about it are very interesting. The other part was about textuality. I was interested in how the very materiality of the text, the ink that gets washed off, that is then contained in water, how that matters when this material ink that had formed the verses before then at some point meets the interior of the body. So there is also this other way of doing Kombe, where you have the water and then you recite over the water, and then the water equally contains the verses, and this is also drunk. But for me it was more interesting to look at the writtenness, the way that you have this ink that actually has a particular shape, and this shape is really, really important, because if it doesn't have this shape, then it doesn't become the Quranic verse. And so for me it was really interesting to really look at this process of how the ink itself is then, well, finds itself in the water and then finds itself in the end in the body. Finally, what was like an umbrella that shaped my dissertation was that I realized that I couldn't stop doing fieldwork in coming back. The fieldwork was, I mean, on the one hand, I was connected to my interlocutors anyways on Facebook and other media. But also I found that I had to reflect on my own writing, my own typesetting, my own way of actually like putting this into writing, into text, while I was writing about text that is denied this visual legibility. And so I was very much reflecting on what I was actually doing in writing this. And so my fieldwork sort of continued to my desk of me observing what is actually happening in my writing. And how that, of course, also connects to my body sitting in front of the desk, my back, for example. That, I think, is something where I really want to also take this further and really think about how can we in academia think more closely about the practices that we do and how they relate to the topics that we have. So now me writing a dissertation, because this is how we do dissertations, about text that is denied visual legibility, how does this relate and can we make something meaningful out of this relation? Yeah, so this is one of the things that I really want to also take up in my next project and probably also the next and the next. I realized during the fieldwork that it matters very, very much of how people want to shape your topic as well. So I did not come with a ready tailored project and wanted to just find out about Kombe, but I learned about Kombe in fieldwork, and then I decided to follow this up because I saw also that people were interested in me following this up. And there's this, maybe a small tiny anecdote. There was this instance where somebody learned about my research through another person and then said like, yeah, I can talk to that person. He was a very highly qualified Islamic scholar, and yeah, so he was really, I have a lot of respect for him. And so I went to the interview. I was very excited and also nervous. And then I started talking a little bit, and then he talked a little bit, and then at some point we found out we're actually talking about different topics here, because he understood me to do research about Pombe, which is alcohol, while I was doing research on Kombe, which is this Islamic medicine. And I mean, we really had a good laugh after that, but what that also shows me is that his way of seeking this interview with me, because he didn't approve of me researching Pombe in an Islamic framework, that was something where it showed to me that it does matter for people who live in the places what and how we shape our anthropological research. And then he was very happy for me to do research on a topic that was much more acceptable, and the interview still was very, very good.
So my name is Leigh-Ann McSweeney, and I'm currently working as a junior communications officer at Deutsche Stiftung Weltbevölkerung, DSW. And before that, I completed my master degree in the Master of Atlantic Studies in History, Culture and Society at the Leibniz University in Hanover. The title of my master thesis was Youth Participation in Political and Social Movements in Post-Independence Senegal, and with an analysis of the influence of hip-hop culture in the context of the presidential elections in 2012. So I started really by looking at the role that music played in Senegalese society, and also the role, of course, of youth in the society. So, and then through looking at that, I saw how the two quickly merged together. So really after independence, youth really stood out as a group that would really fight up for themselves and for what they wanted. So an example of a movement early on in the late 80s, early 90s would be the Setsetal movement. That was a movement really that was born out of the dissatisfaction with the government and the government's ability to actually do garbage disposal. So the streets were becoming dirty and everything like that. So the youth really took it in their own hands to clean the place up. And also it was not only a physical cleansing of the area, but also morally they wanted to be good citizens. And also their hip-hop culture kind of comes into it a little bit, because a big part of that movement was wall murals, which kind of emulate graffiti in hip-hop culture. So they had these big wall murals all over the place, and they really acted as a reminder to people of various things. There was murals depicting HIV and AIDS, and really it helped the people to understand these topics. Basically, it was also a way for the youth to communicate with other people in their societies. And then when hip hop really became prominent, came back to Africa through Europe, we really started to see the influence that it was having on the youth, because they were using it as a tool to express their views, express their dissatisfaction. And already in the 2000 elections, they were using their lyrics there to already express their dissatisfaction with the government, and they really hoped for change. And they were able at the time to actually bring about this change, as Abdoulaye Wade was elected. He really promised the youth SOPI, or change, and that was really hopeful for the youth, but it quickly turned into something that the youth hadn't hoped for. There was a lot of political issues with education, unemployment. So then what I really focused on as well in the thesis was the 2012 elections, where the youth said enough is enough, and they actually formed a movement called Y'en a marre, meaning enough is enough. And they then really stood up for their rights again, went out into the streets demonstrating. So the group consisted of students, activists, also rappers, and other people from the hip hop culture. It was in the context of a power outage, actually, that this group, Y'en a marre, meaning enough is enough, came to fruition. So it was a group of friends who were students, activists, they were all sitting together, and suddenly the power went out. So that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for them. So that's when they established this movement. And hip hop played a big role in that, because many of the members were involved in the culture. So they went out on the streets demonstrating, and then, of course, that wasn't really acceptable in the eyes of the government, so demonstrations were banned. And then that was really when the role of hip hop became prominent, because the artists were able to actually express their views more prominently then through their music, and obviously then that was allowed because they weren't going out physically demonstrating. So yeah, there was this kind of lyrical activism at the time where they really used that as their own voice and the voice of all of the youth in the community. Some of the demands that the youth had was obviously for employment. They were very dissatisfied as there was high rates of employment in the country. Even people who had completed their school years and also even university were really struggling to find employment. And also just in general, the health system wasn't great. They were really struggling there as well. Yeah, so they were some of the major issues. I conducted my research by using a variety of different sources, from documentaries to online articles, obviously books as well. But as the topic was quite current, it was sometimes difficult to find some sources. So also there, I used podcasts, and also the lyrics of the songs themselves really were important in my research. So after conducting my research, it really did become clear to me that hip-hop really was a vehicle for the youth to bring about change in 2012. And looking back on the role of youth in Senegalese society anyway, you could argue that they would have come together and rallied together anyway, but I think hip-hop really brought a new dimension to their activism, and it really helped them to obviously have their word heard as well on social media and the internet. So I think it really propelled their cause. Senegal has a very rich tradition of oral history. There's prominent figures in the society, griots, who were and still remain to be very important characters within the society, as they are praise singers. So they in the past would have praised kings and queens, and now maybe politicians. So I think that I'm not sure if hip-hop would have found such a stable ground to land on in other countries, but as in Senegal, this rich oral tradition was so strong, I think that it became a fertile ground for hip-hop to grow on. Something that was quite surprising for me in my research was that I saw that the politicians really recognized early on the power that the youth had, and especially the power that they had through their use of hip-hop culture as well, because it was often the case that the politicians would try to bribe the hip-hop youth to actually support them. So that was quite surprising for me, that they also recognized early on, okay, this is something that we need to pay attention to because the youth are listening to this. Yeah, so there was another election in 2019, and there Macky Sall, who won the election in 2012, was re-elected for his second term. Also, I think the youth are still fairly dissatisfied with the whole situation at the moment. Also, shortly after the election in 2012, I think around 2013 and 2014, new songs were appearing from these groups, from these youth, where they really were criticizing Macky Sall and his way of governing, because he wasn't really sticking to the word of what he said beforehand. So there still remains a dissatisfaction there. Legally, the presidential term in Senegal is limited to 2 terms now, so there will be hopefully a changeover again in 2024. So it'll definitely be interesting to see, I guess, who the youth will rally behind in that election.